Okay. While we're getting started, I'll kind of go into the meat of, or at least an outline of what we'll be talking over, which will allow me to skip on, and also do an intro. So for the next, I think, roughly 15, 20 minutes, you're with myself, Fraser. So I'm CEO, one of the co-founders at cheqd. Anchor, who's in the room as well. CTO, another one of our co-founders. We have a booth upstairs. We've been there for the last 3-4 days. We'll be there for a little bit afterwards as well, if anyone has any questions following up from this. If I carry on winging this, what we'll be kind of focusing on is kind of 3 areas. So okay, let's give this a second shot. Perfect. Yeah, yep, there we go. Thank you. Right, so obviously I've introduced myself, Anchor. Our CMO was here for most of this week. Anchor, some of you may know just from his work in various standards bodies, all this kind of jazz. What do? We focus on providing kind of trust infrastructure, trust registries, but for those of you who were watching Martin's presentation about an hour ago, we focus on enabling micropayments, as he describes them, for credentials. So verify back to issuer. We do that for any kind of use case. We don't actually offer credential issuance ourselves. We instead work with kind of vendors around the world who do that themselves. But we're very much focused on that kind of verify pays to issuer micropayment flow, as well as providing trust registries and functionality in general. Obviously, a bunch of associations we're part of, but the main thing that we're kind of covering on. So I think, firstly, the split between public-private enterprise, or at least public-private projects, and demonstrating kind of where that kind of current split is. Because I think, obviously, there's a huge focus on EUDI, but actually, when we've looked at numbers, I think it's not necessarily mapping out that way. Then go into some private sector expectations around monetization. Obviously, that's already been touched on in Martin's presentation, but also this. And then finally, looking into more credential value. So if we are expecting to be paid or paying for credentials, how does that break down? How does that kind of change? What's the infrastructure required? Okay. So starting off with public versus private. One thing I went through before kind of pulling all this together was the agenda for last year and this year. And it's quite an interesting signal in terms of how that shapes up. So 2024, there was a huge, obviously, natural focus on EIDAS, EUDI. I think credit to Martin and the Kubik and Cole team, the agenda this year is very much focused on like the assumption that EIDAS, EUDI is coming, now to focus on enterprise adoption, actual kind of business adoption of this, with the addition of AI, so throwing that in there as well. So yeah, credit to them, I think, of being almost ahead of the curve of where most people are thinking. So probably the first place I want to start is, this was put together by Key State Capital. So this is the Web of Trust, for those who haven't seen it before. The website is up in the top right-hand corner. If you take Alpha off, this was their pre-release website that I think is now live. So if you take Alpha off, use that same address, it will take you in. But this basically shows the breadth of kind of decentralized ID credential projects worldwide. And what kind of becomes immediately apparent is just how many of them there are. Obviously, if you're looking down the left-hand side, just that ratio of 1 to 3, 1 to 35, or like 1 to 3.5, we'll see that kind of ratio continuing through the presentation, but that kind of gives you an idea of how many private projects there are going on versus the number of kind of public projects. And that kind of stacks up into what we've seen like in terms of data ourselves. So we recently ran a market survey. So we put that out both to our direct partners that we work with, but we also put it out into the wider ecosystem. So we had respondents both from people we directly work with and people that we don't. But I think what was really interesting was the kind of exactly what that split shows, which I think is kind of similar to that breakdown in terms of public versus private. Obviously, that there is a range. Some are getting more revenue from public funding. So obviously, the likes of the teams working for Sprint. There's obviously multiple kind of government funded projects out there. But I think what's really interesting is just the sheer amount that are working either entirely for private enterprise, or that's where the majority of their revenue and funding is coming from. And we also see that in terms of dollar value. and I think if we kind of look, yeah, this is the best one to kind of illustrate it. But so it's not just in numbers of projects, it's also coming through into the revenue as well. Surprisingly, when we did a market survey, we asked everyone what their actual revenues were. And yeah, again, surprisingly, people actually were pretty open and told us. And so when kind of aggregated up, again, it follows that rough like 1-to-3 ratio that we're seeing in terms of private versus public. I think that's going to increase. So I think obviously that's the current state of play. I think that ratio is going to blow out to probably 1-to-20, 1-to-100 over time. I think to Martin or some of the examples earlier, the government interaction is going to be extremely small versus the number of private enterprise and private credentials kind of moving around. And then one of the kind of shifting into that payment flow and looking at kind of the micro payments or general payments for credentials. So we had roughly 3/4 of all respondents expecting that either them or their clients or the people that they kind of work with in general expect to either pay or be paid for credentials, whether they are a verifier paying across to an issuer or an issuer expecting to monetize those credentials. Just a reading to kind of the bottom bit, for those that didn't, typically what we saw in the responses was they were working on use cases where it didn't make sense for them to charge. And I think that very much fits into what, say, Nick from Doc was describing, which is if you're looking inside an enterprise that has multiple groups, multiple companies, it doesn't make sense to be charging across those organizations. So then payment, this actually came up as a poll question, I believe, in the last session in the panel. So when we kind of drill down into if you're being paid or you're expecting to be paid, how do you think that is going to be set up? So obviously I think issuing organizations, typically the response there was that it's government basically paying to issue credentials on behalf of its citizens, but by and large they're expecting, most respondents were expecting verifiers to be paying, receiving organizations to be paying, and I think that very much follows Martin's kind of outline of those micropayments. Then if we're looking at individuals and holders, that was use cases typically following the model that a lot of people would see around passports. So where you're actually buying a credential that you then hold and receive. So yeah, there was kind of obviously some range, but by and large kind of verifying, the expected to be paid by verifiers. Okay, getting into this, when we kind of drill down into if you expect to be paid or if you either expect to pay or be paid, will you know that relationship in advance? Like, will you know your counterparty? Obviously, if you're issuing credentials out, in theory, they could be taken anywhere. So over the long run, a lot of what we were being told was, over time, these ecosystems are going to break apart. Your credentials will end up in places that you've never kind of had an interaction before, which means that whilst you may start off with a closed ecosystem, over time that is going to break apart and those credentials are going to end up in all over the place, which means that, yeah, so initially very much starting off from consortia, and I think for anyone building kind of decentralized ID, self-sovereign ID, credential businesses, I think now, typically you will see that everyone is building either for a single organization or they're building for consortia. So it is very much following that model of build with a defined group and then they're kind of opening up over time. Which then kind of brings us into credential value. So we've obviously touched on, if I kind of focus here on, expecting to be paid or paying for credentials. There's obviously an expectation of like credentials having value. So I think this diagram on the right-hand side, I think illustrates that need or the potential need in certain use cases for micro or nano transactions, again, as Martin was describing. This diagram originally, and there was an article by Antti Kotunen, who was involved, I think, in Findi, on looking at kind of value chains and looking at how that changes over time with the introduction of credentials. The long and the short of it is typically the value received is on the verifier side, the user, the holder, and the verifier. But obviously for the issuer can come with costs. And I think that's why that kind of expectation of being paid for credentials kind of is emerging. I think the best example I've got with this would be, and the example Antti gives is receipts. If you're issuing receipts as it currently stands, there's obviously a paper cost. But if you shift that into a digital realm, you're having to do IT transformation, you're having to do something, especially if you're a small firm, which you may not have a system for because you typically do this using paper. So you're incurring a cost that you may not receive value for. I think as well, historically, there's maybe been an expectation that an entire ecosystem will move as one, but in practice, that's very, very difficult to do. And by creating incentives for issuers, you can kind of get the ecosystem moving a lot quicker. Which then, I guess, this is almost a truism. I'm not sure if it's even worth pointing out, but like because there's that expectation of being paid for credentials, it kind of brings, I guess, returns us to credentials as they currently stand are one of the few data formats that aren't being charged for. If you look in any other industry, especially kind of marketing and well, data markets in general, data has value, right? It's how those markets exist. So I think this is basically just returning credentials to mirror or like bring them into line with how other data is treated worldwide. And largely kind of follows exactly the same process in terms of like how you derive or calculate that data. And ultimately, it is a market that will price this data going forwards. Which I then think there are some big implications of moving to this model. So if we look at credential having value, it shifts from it has the potential to massively change how ecosystems form, how people are charging for software. Again, using receipts as an example, generic credential issuance is going to have to drop. It will be a race to the bottom for issuers. If you're providing software which is generic issuance, generic verification, possibly even just the wallet, the cost per credential is going to have to drop substantially from where it currently is. And I think the kind of indicative number that we give to receipts is I think roughly where that's going to go down to, because it does have that kind of reference point. Which then means, obviously, if you're issuing those credentials, your revenues are going to drop over time. It will almost be like ID&V or kind of KYC processes at the moment. Just the cost is going through the floor. Which then I think means that there are different ways of charging that will emerge, which will focus more on the credential value, more looking at like embedded finance models where you can start to make revenue off the movement of funds through the system. But it's a very, very different mindset and a different approach to, I think, what is currently going on, especially because as the market currently stands, and I think Nick is a great example of a kind of forward thinker from Doc in this, most of the SSI vendors, most of the decentralized ID companies, credential companies, very much working as software as a service businesses. Like that's how they're operating. And this requires a very big mindset shift into, actually, we're going to become a fintech because there is money moving through the system, and therefore we need to adjust our thinking and do it that way. Formatting's not been great here, but I think the final slide on this is, before I wrap up. So the final slide on this is obviously if you are beginning to charge for credentials, if they're going out into an ecosystem, you need supporting infrastructure for that. And obviously we're seeing emergences of trust registries, both inside the EU and kind of abroad. But currently none of them are discussing commercial models, from what I can understand. It's very much how is trust managed inside this ecosystem, how are credentials managed inside this ecosystem, how does that break apart? But very little of it is, or none of it, as far as I'm aware, is focusing on how do we price these credentials both inside an ecosystem and outside? How is that discoverable? How is that negotiated? How is there feedback on the pricing? None of that exists at the moment. But I think that's going to rapidly come around where it is built into those trust registries. We are seeing, like, you will see transparent pricing, because if credentials are moving outside an ecosystem, they have to be. There isn't kind of room for negotiation there. So if I just shift on to kind of wrapping all of this up, because we've kind of touched on, I think, three kind of topics which are kind of interlinked together. So private projects, I think the biggest, probably one of the biggest takeaways on this is private projects are already dwarfing public sector. And I think, again, rehashing Nick's argument from earlier, like if we're waiting for everything to come along and be perfect, it will be too late. And actually there are people already moving in the market at scale that are getting adoption that are well on their journey because they aren't waiting. And then shifting through, and obviously yeah, going into the monetization side of things, so won't rehash that. But I think the kind of biggest shift after that is then like that mindset shift of credentials having value has a really big impact both in terms of the way the markets are going to form, the potential value capture for vendors as they shift from maybe being SaaS into fintech as a mindset, and then the supporting trust registries where everything's very, very early, but I think it needs to have some kind of market element which currently isn't being thought about. Yeah, so to wrap up, I've got, I think, hopefully time for questions if anyone does have any. And otherwise, I'll be at the back of the room and upstairs for the rest of the day. Thank you for your time.
First of all, thank you very much. This was really insight-packed, and we had the hiccup at the beginning, so I won't steal the time for some questions. Are there questions in the room to Fraser regarding what he just presented? I know it's Friday, almost afternoon. Questions? Sorry.
Yeah, I think you mentioned it that nobody is right now dealing with this topic. What about, because right now in the implementing acts, all the standards are setting right now. So how should then these ecosystems say, okay, we want to charge people, but the whole standards are not a demand by the EUDI wallet. So it's like, okay, we cannot really use this existing European ecosystem. Do you think this would be a real blocker for monetization, or that there is the risk that another system gets adopted? Because a lot of people say, well, I will not adopt the EUDI wallet because I cannot charge people. So how do you think it's because normally the issuer cannot decide in which wallet it will get issued?
Yeah, fair point. So I think within EUDI, especially the government issued stuff, I don't think that will necessarily have monetization flows. I think where it's going to be more specific is private sector. I think there'll almost be like a split. Anything public sector will be, I would expect, largely paid for by the government. But I think where it's going to shift into is, anyone in private sector, it will be following that kind of breakdown that Martin had of either your cost saving, you're charging for credentials. But I think that's where I can see you're sat next to someone from Nemirial, and I saw those guys present the other day. So I think there's going to be multiple like emerging approaches to this, and I think over time we'll coalesce them into something that probably does get standardized in terms of like an infrastructure and set of stuff like protocols all the way down. And then after that, I think so. I would expect a bit of like exploration, people pushing forwards, and I think over time it will kind of coalesce, hopefully, into something standardized.
Okay, thank you very much. And thanks again.
Thank you.